to the very foundations of our own democracy, including voter suppression, the prevalence of dark money in politics, and even attempts to overthrow legitimate election results simply because the loser does not like the outcome. The Center for American Progress is hard at work combating democratic backsliding at home, even as we work to develop strategies to combat it abroad. The erosion of democracy and human rights in India is particularly important for several reasons. First, there's the simple fact of India's growing role in the world. Of course, we've all heard that India has recently officially become the world's most populous nation, and it appears that it will stay in that position for the foreseeable future. Beyond its sheer size, let us acknowledge that there's simply no way we can solve the climate crisis without involving India and having leadership from India. Indeed, it's essential that the US and world powers like India work together in tackling the crisis. And the possibilities for partnership between our countries here are almost endless. India is also a nuclear power, and transforming its relationship with Pakistan is critical for peace, not only in the region, but globally. And of course, the US is keenly interested in the role India might play as we try to manage an increasingly contentious relationship with China. In all of these ways, it's clear that India will continue to play a critical role on the world stage, and the US knows this very well. Yet, we've witnessed alarming developments that have recently shaken the foundations of India's democracy. The erosions of rights and freedoms, increasing control over the press, attacks on opposition leaders, pervasive sectarianism and misogyny, the questions of the independence of the judiciary. All these and more you'll hear about today. These developments have had devastating consequences on so many Indians, but they have also led to greater uncertainty about India's political future, with serious ramifications for any security or economic cooperation. While I fully support the notion of the Prime Minister of such an important country visiting the White House for serious and substantive talks, was it appropriate to shower him with so much pomp and circumstance under these conditions? And the fact that there was but one public question uttered by a journalist about India's democratic backsliding was troubling indeed. Even more troubling and emblematic of India's current reality is what happened next. First, Mr. Modi denied any such problems exist at all and faced no public challenge for issuing such a patent falsehood. And second, the Wall Street Journal reporter who dared to ask the question has been attacked and threatened and vilified by the Hindutva world for asking the obvious. As our panelists will discuss today, forthrightfully supporting human rights and democratic practice in India is essential to the well-being of 17% of the world's population, as it is to a long view of India as a healthy, stable world power. To state it plainly, India cannot be a bulwark of any battle between democracy and authoritarianism if it ceases to be a democracy. I will leave it to our panelists to explain the situation on the ground in detail, and I look forward to their remarks. I'm honored to say a few words here, not simply because I'm an advocate for human rights everywhere, but precisely because of my love and deep respect for India, for its religions and its cultures. Let no one say I criticize India out of animus or lack of understanding. I was literally shaped by India, having fallen in love with it when I first traveled throughout the country as a teenager. I became a religion major in college precisely because of my love for Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, and the rest. I luxuriated in the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and Buddhist sutras. I returned to study in India as a college student and again as a graduate student, and I marveled at the way it had absorbed all invaders and created such an inclusive environment and boisterous democracy. Yes, there had been problems with its democracy before, notably in the emergency declaration in the 70s. But when I was there in the decades after, I really was impressed by India as a democracy. And when you love a place deeply and it's made such an impression on you and been so important in your life, it's all the more painful to see it veer off the path of tolerance and mutual understanding to one of religious nationalism and illiberalism. Now, I face no danger for saying a few brief words here, but unfortunately, the same cannot be said for our panelists. I salute the bravery of each of you for speaking the truth today and sharing with us and the world what you know about the situation on the ground. Restoring social trust in democracy, both here in the US and in countries around the world, is one of CAP's key priorities. Please know we have your back. Threats to democracies have reached a crescendo, and CAP is committed to developing and executing strategies that prove that democracies can provide tangible and meaningful dividends for all their citizens. We'll stay at it with so many brilliant partners in the US and globally. It's now my pleasure to turn the virtual podium over to CAP's new Senior Director of National Security and International Policy, Allison McManus, to introduce our panelists and moderate the discussion. Allison, take it away, and thank you.
Well, thanks so much to you, Andy, and thanks so much to everyone for joining. To sum up some of Andy's remarks, India now not only boasts the largest population in the world, but it's often referred to as the largest democracy in the world. Of course, as we have learned even in the United States, democracy means much, much more than just holding elections. So today we're looking forward to a vibrant discussion on democratic backsliding in India and an exploration of its impact on the country's role as a world power. Before we get started, I just want to thank my colleagues at the Center for American Progress for their work in organizing this event, especially my colleagues Hiba Malik and Sadhna Mandala for their work in organizing this panel. I'm especially grateful to our panelists for their courage in sharing their perspectives on India's democratic prospects, especially at a time when we've seen others, including some of their friends and colleagues, harassed, defamed, or even arrested for doing so. We're lucky to have with us Fatima Khan, a journalist based out of New Delhi. She covers politics, communalism, and social justice for The Quint, an award-winning Indian general news and opinion website. She's the recipient of a UN Ladli Award for Excellence in Gender-Related Reporting. And in 2022, she started a flagship series called Everyday Communalism, which illustrates how hate crimes have replaced large-scale riots in India. Raqib Hamid Naik is a Kashmiri journalist and the founder of Hindutva Watch, a research project that documents the rise of Hindu nationalism and the persecution of religious minorities in India. His project has been described by the Washington Post as one of India's only and most comprehensive real-time data sets of hate crimes and hate speech in the country. We have Professor Irfan Nurdin, the Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani Professor of Indian Politics at Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C. He studies comparative economic development, globalization, civil conflict, democratization, and democratic institutions, as well as international institutions. He's the author of several books and received a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. Finally, we have Riya Chakrabarti, the Policy Director for Hindus for Human Rights, an organization that advocates for human rights around the world and resisting religious nationalism. Riya leads the organization's advocacy efforts with government actors, advocating on behalf of political prisoners and in support of democracy in India. Her writing has appeared in Foreign Policy magazine, The Diplomat, and South Asian Voices. We're so happy to have you all here today. And I would love to turn things over to Irfan to begin. Let's just start with getting a sense of how we got to where we are. The Indian Constitution is one that is founded on secularism and a secular rule of law. What has changed under the BJP, a party which enjoys immense public support? To what extent do you believe that developments over the past decade are understood within and outside of India?
Allison, thank you, and thank you to your colleagues at CAP for hosting this important conversation. Let me just start by applauding the work of Fatima and Rakib and their journalistic colleagues throughout India for doing the work they do. As an academic, I'm not an activist, but I sit in admiration of the work of so many countless activists around India and indeed in the United States. To take your question, it's worth sort of going all the way back to the Constitution. So India's Constitution, as you said, is founded in the principles of secularism. They're very deeply inspired by the American Constitution. The framer of India's Constitution, Dr. Ambedkar, studied at Columbia, was influenced by the Bill of Rights and sort of this notion of individual rights, and that's very embedded. So in many ways, the core principles are the same, but the way in which India interpreted secularism was quite different from the way the United States dealt with the issue of religion and the state, where the United States adopts a separation of church and state. There is no church from which India's state was to be separated. And so India's approach to secularism was much more one of the equal treatment of religions under the law, even if this required in practice for different religions to, in fact, enjoy different statuses under the law. So as is now going to be increasingly part of the election campaign, raised all the time, India does not have a uniform civil code. Every religion has the ability to sort of have its own religious civil practices enshrined in the law and protected under the law, even while there is a common civil code for those who choose to opt into it. The reason I start there is because it's worth thinking about what the ramifications of that have been over the 70 years since, 75 years plus since independence. And part of that is that it fostered a narrative among the Hindu majority, and parts of the Hindu majority. We don't want to paint with too broad a brush over here, that minority populations in particular have been appeased by the state, that in fact the majority population's interests and preferences were often discounted, and that what parties were doing was using minority populations as vote banks and sort of acceding to their interests at the expense of the majority. Now, this is a grievance we've seen around the world, right? That same sort of notion of white grievance, for instance, has played out very powerfully in the United States, resulted in the election, of course, of Donald Trump, and has completely transfigured American politics. And the same sort of thing has played out in India over the last 40, 50 years, but it really came to a head, in the early 1990s, when the Hindu nationalist movement kind of went pretty mainstream after many years of sort of existing largely in the shadows, and became a major political force. So the first time they win a national election and form a government at the center that lasts a full 5 years is 1999. And over time, in the certain states, they become more powerful, and it culminates in many ways with the election in 2004 for 2014, with a majority government, the first time over almost 30 years, that you had a single party win a majority of seats. And that, of course, brings Narendra Modi to power. So when you ask what has changed, there are two things fundamentally that have changed. The first is sort of the acceptability of a certain rhetoric about Hindu nationalism in the mainstream of India, and the discourse on the media screens that we watch, social media that we absorb on a daily basis, maybe drawing room conversations, including among those people who might not normally have considered themselves conservative or religious even, but for whom this sort of set of ideas about majoritarianism, why shouldn't the majority get its way, has become pretty mainstreamed. And the second is that the election of a majority government, as opposed to coalition governments, allowed the BJP now to sort of follow that agenda, right, which was pretty public. There was no secrets over here. Follow that agenda without having to compromise to keep coalition partners happy. And so I think it took a lot of observers kind of by surprise when, starting in 2014 onwards, the BJP began through its legislative majority to enact core ideas that were pretty central to its platform. The abrogation of Kashmir's statehood, the introduction of a Citizenship Amendment Act, the notion of a national register of citizens, right? Those are the big things that grabbed the headlines, but essentially we just saw suddenly what unfettered, unconstrained political power might look like. And India, frankly, had not had to deal with that since the late 70s and early 80s. So let me just put one other thing on the table, which is pretty critical to understand. I would argue that India's backsliding in democracy didn't start with Mr. Modi, right? But in fact, the roots and rot in the Indian public institutions really goes back 50 years. You mentioned, Representative Levin mentioned in his opening remarks, the emergency period, right? For all of the excesses and troubling trends of the last 10 years, we haven't come anywhere close to what happened in the emergency period in India, right? In the complete abrogation of the constitution, the suspension of habeas corpus, the jailing in the thousands of political opponents, of journalists, etc. So, but what we saw then, and what we're seeing now, and what we're seeing in between, is that India's public institutions, its bureaucracy, its judiciary, its civil society, its media, are not robust enough, are not institutionalized enough to really stand as checks to executive authority, to strong executive power. And so a lot of what we have taken for granted as students of democracy around the world, the notion that all of these institutions will protect democracy, has been fundamentally undermined. And it's not just in India, it's all over the world, right? The reason we're in a global democratic recession is because in country after country after country, we have witnessed the media not serving its role as the fourth estate to check, but in fact becoming a handmaiden of the government. We've seen the judiciary play that same role. And so it's both important to focus on India, but also to reflect that we are in a particular moment globally. India is an exemplar of that moment. But the rot, I would argue, that we're watching now didn't start with Mr. Modi and the BJP, even if the fact they don't have to work in a coalition has allowed them maybe to be more bold, a little more ambitious in pursuing a particular agenda.
Thank you so much, Irfan. That was a very comprehensive look back, and particularly appreciate the tracing of some of this backsliding back even before Modi's rise. I'd love to turn things to Fatima. Irfan mentioned the changing faces on Indian television, the mainstreaming of Hindu nationalist narratives, and the media as the handmaiden of the government. I wonder if you can walk us through some of the developments in India's media landscape in recent years. And we'd particularly love to hear about your personal experience as a journalist, as a woman journalist in navigating this landscape.
Yeah. So I became a journalist well into the Modi government's first tenure, which meant that I was very well aware of what I'm in for. And so I wasn't at all deluded about, like, the power of journalism or speaking truth to power or any of those things, right? But that also means that I entered the landscape at a point when things were already so bad. When journalists who I've looked up to for decades actually would suddenly one day I'd switch on primetime television and I'd see and hear them say absolute obnoxious, venomous things, that sheer poison that they are completely unabashedly promoting on national television. If I have to give you an example from the last 2 or 3 years, and this is just the one that comes on top of my mind, there's this term that's been popularized by Indian television in the last few years called Thuk Jihad. Thuk is Hindi for spit. And jihad, as you know, has a negative connotation in a global setting. So when the world was reckoning with COVID, India was reckoning with the communalization of COVID, with COVID being given an anti-Muslim color, where Muslims were hounded for supposedly being the perpetrators of COVID, as if that could be a thing. They were accused of spitting. So lots of extremely impoverished people in India are Muslims who have jobs like selling vegetables or fruits. So those are the people who actually face the brunt of much of this harassment. They were accused of spitting in vegetables and fruits and selling them to Hindus. And that's not something that happened in one colony or one area, that it wasn't a localized event. It was something that spread across the country. It's something that vegetable and fruit vendors who come from the Muslim community continue to face to date, 3 years since COVID. And all of that has been a result of television propaganda, of hateful news channels. So when people say, oh, these are just words, these are things that this is hateful, but it's something that we can counter using words. But that's something that maybe you and I can do. For a majority of people in India, for a majority of Muslims who don't speak this language, who don't look this way, who aren't allowed in liberal elite circles, it's actually a very, very horrific state of existence. In terms of journalism, I'd say the one speck of hope that I see, and I don't see any personally in any of what I do, and I'm not saying that to, in any way negatively influence any aspiring journalist who might be watching this, but I'm saying that I do what I do because I thoroughly enjoy it. I really, really live for what I do. I'm completely committed to my profession in a very, very visceral way. But I have no hopes of how it will change the world, mostly because I do what is known as English journalism, right? Which isn't a language spoken by a majority in the country. So where I do see some hope are these sudden burst of YouTube channels in extremely local languages, Hindi, dialects of Hindi, but also other languages that India has, which are anti-right-wing, anti-bigotry. These channels are started by local, people who weren't really trained in journalism, but they took it upon themselves to do something about the state of affairs. Of course, even people like Rakib and the incredible work he's been doing at Hindutva Watch. I feel that there's hope to be found in these little corners, because I feel often when we talk about social media, we do tend to focus on the negative impact of it, right? It's, especially in India, ever since internet has been made cheap and easily accessible, of course, that's given rise to easy dissemination of fake news and horribly atrocious WhatsApp forwards, and all of that is there. But I also feel that there is a counter movement, there is a counter narrative being started at some level on these YouTube channels by these local language speakers. That is where I see some hope. I feel in general, and this is a global problem, not an India problem, the media model in itself is broken, right? So what am I doing? I'm working for a small independent news organization. There are about 5 or 6 of those in India, and they're punching way above their weight. One, they don't have those kind of resources. I really enjoy ground reporting. That is the one thing that I think I'm somewhat decent at and would feel that I can contribute in a way. But it takes a lot of resources and it takes money. And if you are in an independent media house, you don't have that kind of backing. And what do you do then? Then you look for corporate funding. The minute you get some corporate funding, it is inevitably tied to political biases. And that shows in your reporting. More importantly, because what the journalism I do is in the English language, I feel like while it might help spread some awareness outside the country, I think within the country, its reach is so limited that often I find that we're just preaching to the converted. And that then becomes a problem. So it's important to empower these local media organizations, individuals, honestly, who are just doing the best they can to counter hate, counter fake news, ask greater questions of why the economy is in absolute doldrums, and yet the majority of this country continues to vote for a bigoted party, right? Those are more, I think, intellectual conversations we need to have with ourselves and with people around us. But I think personally for me and the kind of journalism I do, in the last couple of years, I've made it a point on myself that whenever I go and cover a hate crime, I'll not just meet the victims of the hate crime, right? I'll not just go and meet the Muslim family, the Muslim mother who's wailing on losing her son, being lynched by Hindutva warriors. I'll also make it a point to go and meet the perpetrators of the said hate crime, right? Which is a very challenging and difficult task, but it's something that I feel is my responsibility, because 2 things happen when I go and speak to them. One, the fact that they're out on bail after allegedly murdering someone, which is a grave charge. They're out on bail in barely a few days' time. That tells you something. B, when you go and interview them, right? Why is it's important to understand that these are not fringe elements. They're speaking to a certain section of society, a section of society that is today extremely vocal, that lives and thrives for this hatred and marginalization of Muslims. So when I go and speak to them, it's important to understand what is motivating them, what is driving them to suddenly turn against their own neighbor who they've been living with for the last 2 decades. What is incentivizing them, and who is incentivizing them? B, what it does, I think, when they sit in front of my camera and speak unabashedly about the crimes they've committed, about how they took a Muslim man, pulled him by the beard, and paraded him around as his 7-year-old Muslim daughter clung on to him and begged them to please spare her father. This is a real incident that I'm citing, which happened in Kanpur in Uttar Pradesh, where a rickshaw puller was beaten and paraded and forced to chant Jai Shri Ram as his 7-year-old daughter clung onto him. And there I went and met the Bajrang Dal activists, the Hindutva activists, and I asked them, why did you do this? Why did you turn on that man? And when they talk, they talk with a certain sense of impunity, right? Who else would sit on camera and completely confess to their crime? In fact, they go in details about their modus operandi, how they went about mobilizing these crowds that would harass and beat this man. So when that happens, I'm also telling the audience that, look, these men are not acting in their individual capacity. They have been emboldened by a certain political party. They've been given posts in their local area. They're office bearers of their political party at a local level, which is enabling them to commit these crimes. And so I think for journalists like me, it is our responsibility to contextualize these hate crimes, to tell you that these are not happening out of nowhere, that sure, Modi is in power and it's enabling certain people and it's bringing out the closeted bigots, but it's also very well curated and manufactured, which I think is something all journalists today need to make a point to say and bring out and illustrate as vocally as possible through our work.
Thank you so much, Fatima. And I really appreciate, I know it's probably not easy to speak so frankly about the situation for the media and your pessimism there, and appreciate also the fact that you've outlined some, let's say, areas of hope, which I think is a great transition, Rakib, to hear from you. Fatima mentioned both the sectarian vitriol that's a feature of Indian mainstream media, as well as the difficulty and rarity of work covering hate crimes. You are the founder of a project that's considered the most accurate and real-time data set of hate crimes and hate speech in India. So would love to hear from you about trends that you've been following, particularly interested in hearing about regional trends like the situation in Kashmir. And then, maybe a little bit more as to what Fatima was alluding to in terms of the role of political rhetoric and the environment that's created in which these hate crimes and hate speech are thriving.
Yeah, thanks for that question. When it comes to the political rhetoric, I would say 100% that there is this clear correlation between the hate speeches by the prominent BJP members and the rise of hate crimes that happen on the ground against religious minorities, particularly Muslims and Christians. Because when the Prime Minister of the country makes statements like rioters can be identified by their clothes, and when you have the Home Minister of the country using dehumanizing language, referring to Muslim migrants as termites, and then you have a senior minister in Modi's party named Anurag Thakur, who raises slogans like "shoot the traitors" in reference to Muslim protesting against the discriminatory citizenship law. That is simply a tactic endorsement and, in fact, a direct marching orders for the BJP's ideological parent, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or the RSS, and its militant wings like Vishwa Hindu Parishad and Bajrang Dal to target minorities. And that's exactly what's happening in India since 2014. And we have witnessed a huge surge in hate crimes, beef-related lynchings, hate speeches, and the overall systematic targeting of Muslims, both by the state and non-state actors. And unfortunately, over the years, the coverage of these incidents by the mainstream media outlets has diminished, partly due to the fact that there is an ongoing crackdown. And the other side to it is the corporate takeovers of some of these outlets, leaving only a handful of independent publishing houses willing to report on such incidents, as Fatima was talking about, and her news organization, The Quint, is one among them. So, and initially these incidents were covered by a few media outlets, but as I talked about this ongoing crackdown, there are just few independent outlets willing to cover these incidents. So what we at Hindutva Watch are trying to do is to kind of fill that gap by locating those visuals of hate crimes and hate speeches through a number of ways. We scrap social media platforms and use our on-ground network of journalists and activists to locate these incidents and disseminate them to the media and public at large, while also maintaining a repository of all such incidents. And to kind of give you a sense of regional trends from the last 5 to 6 months, we have documented our 250 hate events in 10 Indian states, which were collectively attended by our 2 million people. We're working on a report, hopefully it will be out soon. And in one BJP ruled state called Maharashtra, we have documented at least 60 hate events attended by BJP leaders. In fact, one of the hate events happened 4 days back in this district called Malegaon, where BJP, a member of Modi's party, he's a local legislator there, his name is Nitish Rane, he threatened Muslims with a bulldozer and called on Hindu extremists base to not worry about the police cases, because if the cases are filed, he will get them dropped. But also we need to understand that this work of, speaking truth to the power, documenting this kind of work is also dangerous for a lot of folks. And Fatima has personally faced it many times. In fact, just last month, police in Maharashtra, again, the state I was talking about, filed a police case against us under charges like spreading rumors and inciting violence, only because we brought to limelight a hate speech delivered by a far-right leader. And these charges collectively carry a jail sentence of up to 6 years. So if I was in India, I would be in jail and you would see me after 6 years. So the overall trend, the scale, the degree of impunity and the state support enjoyed by these Hindu extremists is extremely frightening.
Thank you so much, Rakib, and thanks for providing such a clear picture, both of the challenges that you face in doing human rights documentation, as well as the context in which you're attempting to do the documentation. I think it's particularly salient that you mentioned the sort of relative protection that you have in doing work outside of India. And I'd love to touch on that a little bit more, because as Andy mentioned in the opening remarks, of course, we've seen other ways in which the state has targeted those abroad. He mentioned the journalist Sabrina Siddiqui, who had asked a challenging question to Modi and then was targeted with harassment. So I'd love to turn to Ria to hear a little bit more about this. Ria, we know also India has a large diaspora population. How has the diaspora engaged on some of the issues that we've discussed so far? And then how has the state also responded to some of that engagement? So yeah, over to you.
Well, thank you. So I think where I can start is a bit on the transnational repression piece of it, because this is where I think the diaspora and the Indian government, where the risks come in for many people in the diaspora. So, Rakib, Irfan, and I are all based here in the US, and we do this work, whether, especially Rakib and I, like on the activist or reporting side of it, right? First of all, like as an upper caste Hindu, I have significantly less risk associated with the work that I do, and my family is not at all at the level of risk as like our Muslim colleagues, or especially our Kashmiri colleagues. Many Kashmiri activists in the US have reported that their families have been visited by security forces in Kashmir, or their friends or loved ones. This is something that I've heard from my colleagues who work on Pakistan's human rights issues as well, that intelligence services in Pakistan have done this. More recently in Canada, there was a Khalistani activist, Khalistan being Punjabi separatist movement, who was killed under mysterious circumstances. In the US, we have like a level of safety that I don't think you would hear about these mysterious deaths of human rights activists. Well, there are a few Russians who I know would disagree with that, but for South Asians, at least, I think for the most part, you don't really hear about these mysterious deaths happening in the US versus in Canada or Sweden or other countries throughout the West. So that has been kind of the traditional transnational repression. But then there's another level of transnational repression, which is more prominent, which is Sabrina Siddiqui is an example of this. The executive director for Hindus for Human Rights is another example. And then another is the New Jersey chapter president of Indian American Muslim Council. All three of these people have been the subjects of serious social media trolling, and they've also, been mentioned by the BJP IT cell head. The BJP IT cell is like the social media chapter of the BJP, and so this leading member of the BJP has mentioned all three of these individuals. Smriti Irani, who is a cabinet minister, has mentioned both Tazim Ansari of IAMC and Sunitha Viswanath, who is our executive director as well, and talked about them as George Soros agents and agents who are, like working with the Pakistan intelligence services to destroy India. And there's, trolling that happens that does silence people. And in the diaspora associated with that are these Hindu nationalist associated groups who are quite loud and try to intimidate elected officials to be silent, not just on India, but on issues related to the Indian and Hindu diaspora, like caste discrimination bills. So Senator Aisha Wahab in California has introduced a bill to ban caste discrimination, and she faced Islamophobic calls and death threats into her office. Many of them originated in the US, and there's been concerted organization within the Hindu right in the diaspora to silence people trying to combat caste discrimination in the US, but it's like in lockstep with the current Indian government. And these are the same groups that are trying to silence efforts to criticize the current Indian government's human rights record or elevate human rights and democracy in the US-India relationship. That being said, the Indian diaspora, the Hindu diaspora has like two parts to it. One is that the Hindu diaspora is disproportionately upper caste. It is disproportionately middle class, upper middle class, and conservative. So versus in India, Modi is actually more popular among Hindu Indian Americans. But at the same time, when we look at who's populating the advocacy spaces of the Indian American community to elevate human rights and democracy in India, it's mostly Indian Americans, and many of them are Hindu American as well. They might not engage explicitly as Hindu groups because many of these Hindu American groups they have a particular politics. Hindus for Human Rights, I will plug our organization and say we do not have that politics, right? And we do not have the homogenized vision of what India should be that these other Hindu nationalist groups do have. And many times Hindu Americans who are part of the not specific homogenized idea of what Hindu Indian America or Hindu India should be, they're often not from North India, they're not upper caste, or they don't speak Hindi. They come from different parts of India that are often considered like the political periphery, whether that's South India, East India, Northeast India. And they associate with cultural groups or with secular groups. And so you'll find a lot of Hindu Americans who may not be speaking explicitly in a Hindu voice, but are organizing as a part of this broader coalition of Indian Americans defending democracy from here in the US and kind of absorbing some of the risks that our Indian counterparts are taking on.
Thanks so much for that, Ria. Like a very nuanced picture of how the diaspora is acting, and the different threats that folks are facing in diaspora. Rakib, I do want to turn it back over to you on this, because I know that this is something that you faced personally, both as somebody who's in diaspora, also as a journalist, a Kashmiri journalist. What has been your personal experience with transnational repression, and how does that impact your work?
I think since moving here in 2020, my family has been contacted at least 12 times by the police and other Indian agencies through various means, like including phone calls, in-person visits, and summons, all related to my work, of course. And in one particular incident that involved my father being summoned to an army camp, where he was instructed to convey a message for me to cease my activities. And last year, I remember receiving a call from a senior police officer from Kashmir who told me that he had a file on me that he received from the Federal Home Ministry, and asked me a lot of questions about my work, my personal life. And I'm also aware of two other Kashmiri journalists who are right now here in the US, who have also encountered the similar situation. And by the way, just to clarify, I am in exile. I'm in self-exile right now. In 2020, I moved to the US to live in exile. But unfortunately, there exists a fear of reprisal from this vindictive regime against critics and dissidents living in the US right now. And there are these genuine concerns about the potential targeting of their families, as Ria mentioned, and that includes the suspension of their overseas citizenship cards. It's kind of a permanent visa for people of Indian origin given by the Indian government. And such incidents have occurred in the past, including with journalist and author Atish Tasir, whose permanent visa to India was suspended in 2019 after he wrote that famous article on Time magazine calling Modi divider in chief. And there is this another apprehension that if these critics return to India, they could be arrested upon arrival, and that's quite possible, because it has happened with some Kashmiris who have returned back, and upon their return, they were immediately arrested at the airport. And there is this another thing apart from transnational repression, because transnational disinformation campaigns are also part of transnational repression. And right now it is being excessively used by the Indian government and its Hindu far-right ecosystem, led by the BJP, against critics, against journalists and dissidents. And it's kind of, pretty alarming, as evidenced by these recent disinformation campaigns against, like Ria mentioned about Sunita, the co-founder of Hindus for Human Rights, and some Indian American Muslim Council leaders, and journalists like Sabina Siddiqui of Wall Street Journal, just for asking Modi a question on the state of religious minorities in India. And these things have a very profound ripple effect on the personal, professional, and social lives of people who are being targeted. Families and friends often sever ties to avoid any potential trouble. And it has happened with me, my friends, my colleagues who I used to talk to almost on a daily basis, people who I have worked for almost a decade in journalism back in Kashmir, India. They don't talk to me at all. And of course, it's quite understandable. I don't want to bring them any trouble, because in some cases, my friends were also called and questioned about me. And to end my point, I want to also make this note that transnational repression is illegal in the United States. And there are safeguards in place to address such issue. And in the past, because when it all started last year, I started exploring it, and I found that FBI had charged Chinese and Iranian officials for targeting US citizens and residents. But however, the extent to which FBI would be willing to pursue action against India, close ally, is kind of like, pretty uncertain for me right now. I'm not sure whether they would, pursue it with the same vigor as they would do with the Chinese and the Iranians.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Rakib. And I'm just very sorry to hear about the the difficulties that your families faced, and also, you know, that you face even in just being able to do something as simple as connecting with friends for your work. And I think it's a very important reminder that even those who are in exile do still face risks, and again underscores how grateful we are for you all for being here. I would like to turn things back to Fatima. We've mentioned, you know, sort of referenced obliquely some of the unique gender dynamics that we've seen in these various forms of repression, but I'd love to hear a bit more from you, particularly that this is something that, you know, not only as a woman journalist you face, but also something that you've reported on quite a bit. Could you just elucidate a little bit more what these gender dynamics look like? How are women or gender minorities specifically feeling this democratic backsliding?
Yeah. I can speak to you as a journalist who is a woman and also a Muslim. And I think this is something that was talked about briefly last year, but just to refresh everyone's memory, in 2021, there was a list made of prominent Muslim women who are either activists or you know, journalists or poets, anyone who in a public capacity has reported against the government or criticized the government. This was a list called Sulli deals. Sulli is this newish derogatory term that has come up for Muslim women in India. It is a play on the word mullah. And that list was basically a circulation of our pictures. And it was an online auctioning of us and our identities that was put forth. And if you'd go to that page, it was a website that was created. If you'd go to that page and if you'd click on a button, it would show you the Sulli deal of the day. And it could be my picture with my name and my details, or it could be someone else's, another Muslim woman's. This happened mid-2021, and then the government and the authorities and the police, they failed to act on it, right? They did not show the kind of interest in actually penalizing or trying to identify the people behind this. And 6 months from then, towards the end of 2021, there was a Sulli Deals 2.0 of sorts called Bully Buy. This time it had cast a much wider web of where it was targeting a far larger number of Muslim women, even those who are not, say, writing in public domain, but perhaps have an active Twitter account where they have criticized the government in some way or form or capacity. And their pictures were put across, and, you know, incidentally, these were women as young as 20 to as old as 60. As long as they're Muslim women, they were targeted in this list. And I actually remember when that had happened, this is something that we talked to each other about, and I'd heard a lot of online discussion and discourse around it, and some people were of the view that this is just online auctioning, right? Like, it's not like they're really literally selling you. And I feel like that kind of betrays the sense of ignorance that people have around gendered hate crimes and cyber crimes, and they don't really understand how pervasive they can be, how humiliating and dehumanizing they can be, but also how they can have a very real consequence, not just in terms of your mental health and emotional health, but also your physical security. For instance, when Bully Buy happened, just a day or 2 days after that, I had to hit the field for some reporting. The Uttar Pradesh elections were around the corner, and I had to go to this village in Western UP, which is not too far from Delhi. And I remember the minute I entered the village, this man walked up to me, and middle-aged guy, and he walked up to me and he said, "Oh, you're that woman, right? I've seen you there." And I immediately flinched and I took like 3 steps back. And thankfully, he was just an admirer of my work. He'd seen my journalism in the past, and he was just referring to some of the videos that I produced in the past. But my instinctive thought was that he's someone who's either scrolled through those auctioning lists, or perhaps even worse, was part of the group that made those lists, you know. And it kind of tells you that there was a very real possibility that he could very well have been one of those. And even if there's like a 0.01% chance that I might come across someone of this sort, it is a very real risk to my safety, my physical safety. And I think that's what people don't understand. I tend to compartmentalize online life and real life, but sometimes the lines do blur out, especially in today's day and age, right? When all of us, whether we're writing for newspapers or online portals, we are all a part of this digital ecosystem where we're sharing our work, we're sharing parts of our lives. So that becomes a real risk. It becomes a real risk for yourself, for your family members, for your loved ones, who you do want to protect at any cost. I think being a Muslim woman journalist also means that you're carrying so much baggage, so much of things that you will be held accountable for that you shouldn't be, right? And I'm saying from even your own community, it's the sense of honor and repute that is constantly attributed to a woman's existence, and that is something that is universal. But when you are doing all of that and you're going and meeting people who are perpetuating and committing hate crimes, it becomes very difficult to navigate that life. Because oftentimes I'm worried that if my stories do too well, people might identify me too much, and that might come in the way of my reporting. But on the other side, I do want people to read my work more, right? But I'm almost scared that if they read too much of it, I'll not be able to continue doing what I want to do. So those are thoughts that I feel like a lot of women journalists don't have to think about that. A lot of male journalists don't have to think about that. I think it's a very specific niche intersection of being Muslim and woman and journalist and a field reporter that lends you this kind of weird dynamic.
Thanks so much for that, Fatima, for sharing that. I am grateful to our events coordinators for giving us time until 12:45. So we do have about another 15-20 minutes. And we are monitoring questions that are coming in through the Q&A function. And so really appreciate that. I will try to weave some of these together and may take some moderators' privileges as well to insert my own questions in with them. So Irfan, going to turn things back to you. And I have kind of a set of questions, so I hope this isn't going to be too complicated to pull all this together. There was a comment about, whether or not we're looking at democratic backsliding as something that's inherent about the fact that there is a single party majority right now in India versus if this is something that is unique, say, to the BJP. Part of this question is whether or not having this kind of single party majority actually lends some stability to the country. And I think this is often a question that comes up when looking at, for instance, India's economic outlook. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to this dynamic, whether or not this is something that's BJP related, something that's single party majority related, and what the overall impact is on India's stability, economic, political, et cetera.
Thanks, Alison. My first book, which was published in 2011, was called Coalition, Politics and Economic Development. And it was a book about the impact of India's coalition governments on its economic prospects. In fact, finds that India, over the course of its history, had grown faster, had attracted more FDI, etc., in the era of coalition government than in the majority government. Now, this was pre the last 10 years, obviously. And that also that this finding is replicated around the world. So the notion that coalition governments are inherently bad for the economy, at least in my analysis and my data, is not borne out. What is true about coalition governments, obviously, is that they require lots and lots of compromise, right? I mean, you have to negotiate with the other side. And what this does is that it just makes it harder to tack to the extreme. It doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on, you have to make compromise. That's the nature of coalition politics. And I think what we realize in the context of democracy is that democracy works best when leaders are forced to make compromise. That is the nature of democracy. And majority governments in any context leave the political minority, whoever the minority at the time, in the cold. They feel disenfranchised. You see this in the United States in eras of unified government where the Congress and presidency are controlled by the same party, members of the other party, right, the minority party, feel much worse about the quality of democracy, feel much more less satisfied about the quality of democracy. And so even while political pundits and those of us who live in DC bemoan the costs of gridlock, as it were, gridlock actually plays out quite well with citizens who say, at least my voices are being represented in governance. There's someone standing up for me. So it's a bit of a contrast. But the good news, I would say, from my own research, is that coalition politics actually can be quite good for the economy as well. And so maybe we don't have to make as much of a choice. We can get the best of both worlds. I do think it's important to distinguish between unpopular legislative mandates, right? I mean, so, elections have consequences. The majority government has the right, in fact, arguably the responsibility to act on its platform. We might not like that platform, but doing something that's consistent with that platform doesn't inherently make the action undemocratic. And so I think we want to distinguish between some of the legislative acts that the current government has passed in the last 10 years from the most systematic societal issues. We haven't even touched on the government's use of the FCRA regulations to really crack down on civil society and to make it much harder for independent civil society to raise the funds required to do work. Now, again, FCRA, they didn't invent it, right? It came out in 1979 under the, it actually came out in 1976 under the Indira Gandhi government during emergency. But every government since then has held it and has maintained it and has used it opportunistically. This government has really sort of leaned into the use of it. That's the kind of stuff that begins to worry about eroding democracy when we don't have a vibrant civil society that can function independently, right? Fatima and Rakiba both talked about the corporatization of media houses and the fact that we have this deep concentration now of media houses. Again, that's something we're seeing globally. And so we really have this insight. So to come back to your initial question, coalition politics, I think, serves as a break on some of the more extremist views of any government. And I think partly what we're reeling about is that India went 30 years from 1989 to 2014, 25 non-stop years, where we only had coalition governments and where we were just used to very little being done on the legislative floor. In 2014, we get a majority government and they immediately get to work, right? And they're doing the stuff they told us they were going to do. But it still hit us like a ton of bricks to saying, oh my God, right? How are they getting all this stuff done so quickly? And I think it leads to a recognition that maybe some of the norms and values of democracy are more fragile than we realize. And I think the same reckoning happened in the United States under Trump, where all of a sudden things that we thought of as being pretty well understood norms about democracy just seem to be up in the air, thrown out the window. And we're like, well, wow, maybe that was a little more fragile than we realized. But we do want to keep the analytic lens separate, right? The illiberalism, the societal religious intolerance that has grown, that seems to have Rakib referred to the impunity with which that occurs, that's independent of what the government is doing in a sense. Now, it happens because partly maybe the sense is that the government has their back, that we want to enforce it. But at the local level, Dalit communities will tell you that they have suffered the impunity of upper caste violence for decades, right? Nothing new in the last 10 years. This has just been daily life. Women will tell you that they have lived in fear forever, right? Well, because the violence that is pervasive in society. So I don't mean to sort of be an apologist for the current government, but I think we're really going to be serious about saying, how do we make sure India's democracy is as robust and as inspirational as it was designed to be? We have to be sort of quite honest about saying which parts of this are really structural, baked into the society, and which parts of this are this current government. Because this government will eventually lose power. That's the nature of Indian politics. Leaders will change over. The society, on the other hand, is likely to stay the same. And I think we could be having the same conversation in 20 years with a very different leadership, a very different government, but in which Dalits are still discriminated against, Muslims are still second-class citizens in their own country, and women are very much second-class citizens in their own country.
Thank you so much for that. I haven't read your first book yet, but now I'm very interested. And if you'll permit me, I may extrapolate out a bit, which is that it seems as though this erosion of state institutions that, as you were saying, I mean, obviously democratic institutions being very fragile already, be very hard to repair. And that may have negative impact on, for instance, economic development. And I might even suggest that it could cause problems in foreign policy as well.
Right. So just if I can just jump in, so think about, what we see in the US, right? Think about executive orders, for instance, right? Executive orders are bemoaned by whichever party is out of power as an abuse of the democratic process, but we like it when our guy does it because it serves to getting through gridlock. Judicial independence is something that has come under a great deal of scrutiny in India. And I think the judiciary is something we need to think about and talk about. But essentially, we're seeing this again all over the world and definitely in the United States. I mean, the single best predictor of how a Supreme Court justice votes on a given case is the party of the president that nominated him or her, right? So is that about judicial independence or is that about partisan politics? And the truth is, my academic colleagues will tell you, is that judges are people and they reflect their society. And so you just end up with a society that's polarized, has judicial institutions that are polarized, has bureaucratic institutions that are polarized, has police forces that are polarized. And it is that root polarization at the societal level that I think Indians have to grapple with, right? The question Fatima asked is so powerful. They said, what happens in a village where people have lived in coexistence? They didn't live necessarily happily, right? Every Indian village is also segregated. The Dalits live across the creek and the upper castes live over here and the Muslims live over there. So this is not kumbaya, this is not some Eden, right? But they lived together. And now all of a sudden, right, a local elder is paraded through the street and humiliated. Something has changed, something breaks over there. And I think that's where the scrutiny needs to be about how do we rebuild from the ground up as opposed to obsessing with what happens in Delhi all the time. And I think sometimes the focus is very sort of that inside the beltway kind of thing and inside Luckhin's Delhi, what's happening in Delhi. But, Gandhi famously said India lives in its villages. And I think some version of that is part of where the solutions lie.
Thank you so much. I realize we have about 10 minutes left, and I do want to make sure that we have a chance to hear from all of the participants one last time to make sure that there's nothing that was missed in this discussion. I also think if folks are willing to humor me, we are here in Washington, D.C. at the Center for American Progress. It's very oriented towards the U.S. government. I would love to hear whether or not you feel that your messages that you've delivered today and the analysis that you've delivered is heard and understood in Washington, D.C. or amongst Western powers, and whether you see any role for Western powers like the United States to play in trying to support a return to stronger state institutions and maybe democratic forward sliding. I will turn it over to Fatima to start.
Yeah. So I feel like when this government came to power, there was this sense in which people felt that because it's come to power with such great majority, almost unprecedented in ways, and not just numerically, but just, what at the time was called the Modi wave, which was popularized as this term that everyone embraced back then in 2014 and to a certain extent again in 2019. There was this sense that no amount of reporting internally can have an effect on this government, but also externally, internationally, this government is beyond shame, right? Like that is the sense that I think in the initial years, many of us did have. I do feel that in the last couple of years, that has shifted a little bit. For example, just now, right, when Prime Minister Modi was visiting the United States of America and, everything that happened with Barack Obama's interview, where he explicitly called out the anti-Muslim hate in India, followed by, I don't know how many in the US picked it up, but a sitting chief minister in India putting out a tweet saying that we have many Hussein Obamas in our own country. He said that, so alluring to Obama's, the controversy around his supposed Muslim past, which he's clarified over and over again. So not only was it bigoted in that sense, but he was also using that to hit out at Muslims within the country. And I did see that the Washington Post picked it up, for instance. And this is hardly the most bigoted thing that chief minister has said, right? If you know Himanta Biswa Sarma, who's a chief minister of an ethnically diverse state called Assam in northeastern part of India, he is arguably one of the most bigoted and vitriolic sitting chief ministers in the country right now. But the fact that he directly targeted Obama, which is something that many felt he could have easily ignored. It was one interview to one channel abroad, but the fact that it did manage to create that kind of ripple within the government, it tells us something. It tells us that speaking up internationally does matter. The fact that Sabrina Siddiqui was targeted and humiliated and trolled to the extent that she was, of course, it's really, really devastating. But when I look at it, I also see that speaking up and questioning and repeatedly hammering home the point that, look, we will not buy into the baseless arguments you make about how India is this incredible democracy and we are living in this incredible unity and diversity mode, which we never really did, right? But the fact that today that facade is being actively questioned, the fact that this is happening today, we are meeting today, the fact that questions are pouring in, there is an increased level of curiosity about what's happening in India. I feel like those are signs that this government obviously does not appreciate that. It will go after people who question it and target it internationally as well. And I'm probably just, looking at a silver lining, but I feel like if they are reacting in that kind of a almost nervous manner, that tells us something. That tells us that internationally what people say of Mr. Modi, what people say of the government does matter to it. So even if it's trying to cover up its tracks, I feel that's a good sign, because honestly, worse things could happen, which would just be pure fascist dictatorship, where they're like, you know what, screw you, this is our country, we're going to annihilate the Muslims, what can you do, right? And I feel like if we've not reached that stage yet, if Prime Minister Modi still has to stand in front of American journalists, stand next to President Biden and say, what are you saying? We've always been a democracy, we're an incredible democracy. I feel like even that tells you something about the need to put up this facade for diplomatic reasons, obviously. But it does give me a glimmer of hope for sure.
Thank you so much, Fatima. Ria, over to you.
Well, my favorite thing to talk about when it comes to recommendations for the US government is often use the human rights tools that are at your disposal. So the US has human rights laws on the books for how it engages with the rest of the world, right? So the one that Indian American activists often talk about is the International Religious Freedom Act. And the US Commission on International Religious Freedom for 4 years now has recommended that India be designated as a country of particular concern because the Indian government has tolerated or encouraged the marginalization of Muslims. So that's one of the many things. But on top of that, you can do things beyond just like that one top level action, right? More targeted actions. So the use of the Global Magnitsky Act to go after particular human rights violators. There have been many civil society organizations who've made these case filings for certain individuals, including the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh. You can use the Leahy laws, which are human rights foreign assistance requirements to apply human rights conditions to security assistance to India. Because of the way the US-India security relationship works, it's a little less straightforward than some of our traditional security alliances, but that is certainly another tool. And this is based on not just human rights concerns with this particular Indian government, but also with previous governments. So the Indian government for a long time, since the 50s, has had this law on the books called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act in Northeast India, and then since 1990 in Kashmir. And this law basically allows the Indian military to conduct domestic operations and allows for a significant amount of impunity for soldiers. We could have a whole webinar on just the human rights violations of the Indian military against Indian citizens. But this is certainly like a place where there are a lot of human rights concerns that have gone unaddressed, but the US actually has the tools to address this. Maybe it doesn't change the behavior, but it does certainly, you know, express American values about human rights and democracy. And then the last thing I would say,
yeah, I'm just going to stop you there. I really appreciate that. I just want to make sure that we have enough time to hear from Irfan and Rakib because we have 2 minutes left. So I will turn it over to Rakib, and then Irfan will give you the last word. So appreciate everybody's timeliness.
Sure, I'll try to wrap it within a minute. I would like to touch upon the fact that there has been a lot of conversation about US strategic interests with respect to its engagement with India. And I strongly believe that the American strategic considerations in the region shouldn't overshadow the concerns related to human rights and democratic values, because only a stable India could serve as a reliable ally. However, such stability cannot be maintained under a leadership of a divisive, inherently communal figure who marginalizes minorities and perpetuates division among the population, pitting the 80% majority against the rest. And as Fatima pointed out, during Modi's state visit, President Obama clearly highlighted the importance of protecting the rights of minorities in India, emphasizing that without such protections, the country risks falling apart. And it's the real threat India is facing today. The potential consequences of it will have global ramification and could result in a global refugee crisis unparalleled in the recent history. And we are talking about 1.4 billion people, out of which 250 million are Muslims and Christians. That's almost 2/3 of the American population. And President Biden should, of course, do well to heed the advice of his former colleagues and take into consideration when shaping policies towards India. And just as Americans deserve a unifying leader who promotes unity and reconciliation rather than hate and divisions, the people of India also deserve the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rakib. And Irfan, over to you for
Thank you.
last thoughts.
Everything my colleagues have said is just so brilliant. It's hard to follow. But let me just say this on the part of the US perspective. The rhetoric that we use has now become reflexive and knee-jerk, right? I mean, so it's sort of a copy and paste from starting with the Biden administration through the Trump administration, and all the way back to the Obama administration. India and the United States are the oldest and largest democracies. In 2018, the Center for American Progress had a signature landmark report on US-India relationship. It's worth looking at that because you'll see exactly the same rhetoric amplified over there, right? The same sort of jargon used. And maybe in some ways it becomes so cynical because we don't actually maybe we don't even think about what the words mean any longer in referring to this. But I think one implication of this is to provide a legitimacy to the government that undermines the work of the journalists and civil society activists that we're simultaneously lauding. So what is it like for one of these activists on the ground in India to ask questions of their own government, and then the government can point to a photo opportunity with the President of the United States, or maybe standing next to at the Quad meeting and having India's democracy being hailed. Even if in the subtext, then there is what seems to be a comment, and we can all read with, microscope sort of thing and see the subtext. Oh, wow, they were posing a question over here. And yet that is all sort of, embedded within the broader rhetoric that serves the sound bites. India's democracy is resilient. I mean, look, for all of the concerns that we've raised, as someone who studies Indian elections for a living, India's elections remain competitive and fierce. And if anyone tells you that they can predict with certainty what the outcomes of the 5 state elections slated for the rest of the year are going to be, I think they're lying to you, right? They're genuinely uncertain competitive elections. Even in 2024, to the extent that the Prime Minister's party is the front runner, that is as much to do with the effective ways in which they've managed their media presence as it is to do with the complete ineffectiveness of the opposition party to mount the campaign. The point is that it's all about the elections. So as long as India has competitive elections, things will change. What doesn't change at the end of the day is some of the deeper forces that have come to the fore that we've been paying attention to today. But again, for those of us who've been paying attention to India for a long time, the same sort of religious intolerance that we see today has been on display over the last 40 years. My parents lived in the same apartment in Bombay from 1972 till they sold that flat in the early 2012, 2013. In 1992, our nameplate on our door came down. And that's because of the riots that hit Bombay, in which 3,000 Muslims plus were killed in a paroxysm of violence. So since 1992, there was no nameplate. It was an anonymous apartment because of the fear of Muslims being targeted in their own homes. That was 1992, right? That is very much was India then, and it's India today. And so we should think about this the continuity. But the responsibility of the United States is not to provide a false veneer of legitimacy simply because it doesn't know how else to talk about a complicated relationship. And I think if nothing else, getting out of the way and allowing India to do what it does, and allowing the activists and journalists and everyday citizens of India to defend their own democracy would be good. But by doing this rhetorical cynicism, we actually make all of that work harder. And that's not fair to India.
Thank you so much, Irfan. I think this is a really important sentiment to end on, and particularly as we do look ahead to elections next year. Thank you all once again for joining. We really appreciated your time, and thanks to all of our audience members, and of course to the Center for American Progress as well for hosting.
Thank you.